Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering.
On this episode, we are joined by two guests, Prukalpa Sankar, co-founder and CEO of Atlan, and Chad Sanderson, the head of data platform at Convoy. And we talk about what else but data contracts. We unpack what is a data contract, why the conversation hit such a nerve in the data community, and finally, some tips for implementing them.
I feel like we need to put a content advisory on this episode. Warning, contains talk of data contracts. In my writing in the roundup, I've become very sensitive to not over discussing this topic. I think that sometimes it can feel very high level and it's not clear exactly how to move forward with this in your particular context. But that's what I loved so much about this particular episode, is that we really did get into implementation questions, like specifics. I'm not going to say that you could listen to this episode and go implement data contracts tomorrow, but I think that it helped really ground me in how the industry has a path forwards here.
Yeah, certainly we didn't give a manual or a step-by-step guide on how to do this right, but I think we talked both about the technical aspects of it and the people aspects too involved with data contracts. So it's definitely a good episode. And without further ado, let's get into it.
All right, welcome back. This is going to be an experiment. This is the first time that we are going to do a multi-guest podcast. So there are four of us here. I'm here, Julia's here, and then we have Prukalpa and we have Chad. Prukalpa, do you want to say hi? What have you been spending your time on recently?
Hi, everyone. My name is Prukalpa. I'm one of the founders of Atlan. And in Atlan, we think of ourselves as sort of like a metadata activation platform. And, I won't go too deep into what Atlan's doing, but something I've been spending a ton of time thinking about is metadata has traditionally been used for a few use cases like data discovery and data catalogs. And some of what I've been spending a lot of my time thinking about is how do you actually sort of activate metadata to solve a ton of problems that the data practitioners, but also data tools face, right? So auto deprecate data assets or, auto trigger data quality tests and so on. Excited for this conversation.
Awesome. Chad, say hi. What have you been spending your time on?
I'm Chad. I work at a company called Convoy, which is a late stage Series E freight technology startup based in Seattle. I run the data platform team, which is the data infrastructure and engineering organization at Convoy. And I have been spending an enormous amount of time on data quality. We are heavy users of the modern data stack. And quality has shifted to become our number one focus for pretty much all of 2022 and will be our number one focus for all of 2023 as well.
Before we move on, can you say more about that? Most modern data stack using companies, I feel like, are still in this adoption phase where they're in the starry-eyed early days of the relationship with these new technologies. And everything feels easy and fun, and you haven't started to see any problems yet. But it seems like you folks are many years into this relationship at this point, because otherwise I think data quality would not be, for 2 years in a row, the thing that you were primarily focused on. What have you seen maybe a little earlier than some other folks?
We're Snowflake, Fivetran, Debezium for CDC, very heavy DBT users. We have one of the more modern data catalogs, Airflow, and even a pretty modern NBS-based BI tool. We use Metabase. And we've adopted all of these things for a while. They've gotten a ton of circulation throughout our data team, which is quite large. We have around a 75, 80 person data team at Convoy. And maybe just for a little extra piece of context, Convoy was at one point a digital freight broker. And the way a freight broker works is they, talk to a shipper, they decide hey, we're going to take these shipments for you. And then they go and communicate. They're basically middlemen between the carriers that are actually trying to take that freight. And Convoy shifted to becoming a marketplace where we push all of this freight to, and then we facilitate these transactions. And the only real difference between us and a traditional freight broker is our data. And it's the machine learning models that we then build on top of that data. So I think this is not to sound super egotistical of Convoy, but there's a lot of companies that talk about being ML driven, but Convoy is like truly a machine learning driven company. Like without it, the business doesn't even exist. And so that was one of the reasons we made this big investment into the modern data stack, is because we wanted our data consumers to move really fast, to iterate super quickly, to get the data that they needed from any source that was meaningful to them, to set up their pipelines really rapidly. And that was great. Like sort of, as you say, it was really solid for about 2 to 3 years. And then we started to see a gradual transition that started off sort of small. It was sort of rumblings in the wind, where we'd hear from data scientists like, hey, we don't really trust this data. We need someone to take ownership over this data asset. We have like a column that should never be null, but is coming back null like 20% of the time. And we have to throw that out of our training set for our machine learning models. And that means we're not training our machine learning data on reality anymore. And those problems like started off small, and our data engineering team were sort of trying to solve them as one-offs. And then they grew and they grew and they grew and they kept growing until the point where it literally consumed basically the entire company. And there was a point where like every single person who worked at data in the organization was waving this giant red flag saying, our data is completely untrustworthy. We are not able to stop things if they break. We have machine learning models that are doing tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars of throughput a year. We don't trust them. And we're having to drop, sometimes 50% of the data. And that was the impetus for a lot of the initiatives we're working on now.
It's a good segue. It sounds like, things work for a while and then they inevitably break unless you figure out the contracts with which everyone needs to abide by. And so everyone is assembled here. We got a good group. We're going to talk about data contracts. And it feels like it's the topic du jour. Everyone on Substack and data Twitter is tweeting about it, talking about it. So I'll give like a quick definition, or at least my definition of what a data contract is, and then we'll jump into the meat of it. So data contracts is really an agreement between data producers, whether it be engineers, marketers, sales ops, etc., and data consumers, often people on the data team, to reliably keep a set of data tables and schemas consistent so that things don't inevitably break downstream and you don't have chaos and this frustration of what happened, what changed, what's going wrong. And so how it's implemented, I think, is really different for different teams. It's kind of this new concept too, like who uses them, who doesn't use them. But we want to get into kind of the meat of what is a data contract and make it a little bit more tangible for folks as a takeaway from this episode. What did I miss? Is that...
So Chad's colleague, Adrian, wrote a fantastic post. He had this like wonderful paragraph that demystified data contracts for me. I was just going to read from it. So are data contracts just a fancy term for APIs? The short answer is yes. The long answer is that the term data contracts is being used to introduce a concept. There must be a formal agreement between the data producers and consumers where one didn't exist before. Okay.
So we just are using fancy words for APIs because we need a buzzword that people can latch onto.
Classic modern data stack in its glory.
I think it is definitely a buzzword, 100%. But I think there's also an implication within the term contracts that has resonated quite a bit with people. I think you're going to lead into this question, so I won't answer it fully. But there's the implication when you're talking about a contract that there has to be a conversation and there has to be an alignment and agreement between two sides. And in many cases, when we're talking about APIs, it can be thought of almost like a one-way transaction, right? I'm a software engineer. I have an API. It is what it is. I produce that for my customers and they can take advantage of that or they can't. But with data, it's a little bit different. Oftentimes the software engineering team doesn't have any understanding of how their data is actually being used or what those downstream use cases are. And so the importance around the collaboration and the contracts with an enforcement mechanism is pretty critical. But like fundamentally, you are right. It is just an API under a different name.
Why do you think it struck such a chord? I think we all kind of recognize a lot of these concepts are not new. They just have different momentum or hype cycles or like gets more engagement by the community. But it felt like this in particular had a lot of like pent up pain, and people on both sides of the discussion, like the summary of it, which we'll get into, is like, yes, wouldn't it be great if we had these contracts where the software engineers knew what they were going to break downstream before they made the breaking change? Like that's the bite-sized one side of the argument. The other side of the argument is like, is that an appropriate burden to even put on a team. There's kind of limits to where their work stops and other teams' work begins. But why did this strike such a chord?
My 2 cents on that is just because how emotional of a problem it is. Like, I think I don't think there exists a data practitioner who has not faced the impact of not having some kind of agreement between like a data producer who changes something inevitably and that leads to something that you're working on a daily basis. Everyone's had the 3 a.m. call that's happened to them, right? Like, I remember this one time for me, prior to Atlan, we used to be a data team ourselves, and I got a call from the Prime Minister's office at 8 a.m. and basically said, Prukalpa, number on this dashboard doesn't look right. And I opened up my laptop and there's a 2x spike that day in the data. So clearly something's wrong. And there was nothing I could do at that point. And I called my project manager, who called my analyst, who called my data engineer. And then he pulled out audit logs, but he couldn't troubleshoot it. And this was like kind of like pre-modern data stack or like around like very early days of modern. So this was way harder to do than it is even today. And with 8 people, 4 hours, like we were figuring out what went wrong. We didn't know what went wrong. And eventually, at the end of all of that, we discovered that the system that we were pulling data from decided randomly to send us, like they were sending us daily data. And then suddenly one day they sent us cumulative data instead for that day. And so suddenly there's this random 2x spike and obviously we lost agility then. But at that moment, like 2 years of hard-earned trust with our stakeholders, right there in that moment, because of not knowing how to answer that question, it wasn't even that something broke. It was not knowing why it broke. Like that trust broke right then and there, right? And that's like story of any data team's life. Like we have a customer, it's a public company, and they built out this like flowchart diagram of what happens in public reporting. And they actually quantified that there's literally 20 days of an analyst's time that is spent on fixing numbers that break. And they quantified this down to like, what happens when something breaks and someone goes into Looker and checks if a calculation changed, and then they message on Slack, and then they look at Jira tickets, and then they send a message to somebody else. And it's a lot of work. And it takes, and I think like Chad quantified this a little bit as well, right? Like at some point, your entire team is consumed with just fixing stuff.
What I'm hearing is like, even though it's not your fault, it's your problem because you end up being the face of the numbers as a data team. And even though it was some vendor, screwed you over, that's not really an acceptable answer. So just getting ahead of that.
It's interesting. I feel like a lot of the success of the modern data stack over the past however many years has been that it is largely permissionless from the perspective of the software engineering team. If you were to say, like, software engineering team, we need the ability to do internal numbers, we need all of these things, all of a sudden that's getting weighed against a Jira queue of like all the user-facing features, and so it gets deprioritized. Now, there's this whole other set of resources that are people with data skills, but generally not with as many software skills, that you can say, oh, I know how to staff a team with this. And actually, they can make a tremendous amount of progress on this without actually asking literally anything from any other part of the business other than like allow an IP to penetrate your firewall. And so we've pushed that model kind of a long way. And then at a certain point, you realize like, oh gosh, we actually may need to collaborate here a little bit more.
I think both of you, you definitely hit the nail on the head. Has anyone heard of Lindy's Law before? Have you heard that? The Lindy effect is what it's called.
I've heard of that, but I forget what it tells us.
I can't remember who the originator was, but Nassim Taleb wrote about it pretty extensively in a book called Anti-Fragile. And it's basically this theory that for any non-perishable thing, like a technology or an idea, the longer that it's around, the length of its life is sort of directly proportional to how long it's already been alive. So if something's been around for 50 years, then you can expect it will be around for another 50 years, essentially. And Julia, you mentioned that, a lot of these, this same exact problem has come by a different name. And that is exactly what happened. Pre-modern data stack, a lot of the legacy, the companies that we call legacy, had all this stuff figured out. Bill Inman back in the 1980s, his original definition of a data warehouse was he essentially understood that if you leave it up to software engineers to create data for operational use cases, and you dump that data, into your warehouse, or it wasn't called a lake back then, but you dump it into your lake and you try to do something with it, you're inevitably headed towards some disaster. So Tristan, as you were saying. And so the data warehouse really functioned as this like integration layer that served as a source of truth that mapped back to reality. And then you build your data marts on top of that, right? Like sort of you build your transformations on top of that and all of the your metrics and those types of things. And when we moved to the Snowflake, to sort of the cloud world, there was a desire, at least that I observed, to go fast, right? Like let's try to, bring in as much data from as many different sources as we possibly can. Let's five-train everything in. Let's ELT it in. Let's use Costco. We need it in real time now. And then let's transform it as quickly as we can. And let's stick it into dashboards as quickly as you can. And when that happens, you've lost now all of that integration that happens. You've actually lost the definition of a true data warehouse. And you've lost the collaboration that comes from the producers actually thinking not just as of data as a byproduct, but as part of the product. And for a long time, I think people thought, okay, well, we can get by without a lot of this governance. And the answer is we cannot. It's actually really important. Like those ideas to me follow the Lindy effect. Like they've been around for a long time. There's a reason why they've been around for so long, and it's because they work. I think that why a lot of those patterns were not followed in the modern data stack is because they were so unbelievably costly to implement. It's really, really hard to have, to as a startup that's trying to move quickly, to hire like 3 data architects to serve as the bottleneck for all of your data and, handle it all sort of, ETL style, do all the design and architecture and everything else. You got to be able to move faster than that. So I see data contracts as sort of an evolution of these very old ideas that just allow people to move more quickly and iteratively in a more decentralized way.
Here, Tristan, you wrote about this in the roundup, how contracts might not be the right word because it's an agreement between two people, whereas like anything that is between people is often fragile. So you need to have like technology and process and habits in place so that you actually can scale the thing. And what I find really striking is like there actually hasn't been a lot of conversation about the details on implementation on this topic. It's all about should we do them or should we not? But the specifics of how do we do them hasn't been as discussed. James Densmore, he wrote about 3 steps. You want to have a CI process to block gate changes that might break downstream models so that your software engineers can't introduce the problem in the first place. You need a metadata store, like a catalog that enumerates all of the schema contracts so people can reference them and understand the why, who's using them, have that lineage. And then a backup tests and alerts because inevitably something will be in breach and you need to alert as soon as possible when things go wrong. Is that it? What have you seen go well in terms of actually having a not anti-fragile data contract? Sorry, being anti-fragile with a data contract.
I think the thing that you mentioned of there not being a whole lot of the implementations on data contracts is absolutely true. And it's one of the reasons actually yesterday, Tristan was sort of referring to this, but we put out an article that, detailed exactly that. Like what is this type of, what does a data contract actually look like? And there's a few tenets that I like to think about and that like basically things that must be true, which is that you need to have some sort of enforcement at the producer level. That is the CI/CD element that James Densmore was talking about.
Can we pause on that for 1 second before you go into the next items on your list? Because this was I know it's so basic, but it was like such an important mental unlock for me. We had a conversation with some folks in the DBT community a week ago, and there was this concept of like producer-led contracts and consumer-led contracts. And I think it was Abhi who was talking about this. And I know that you and Abhi have worked together a lot, so I hope that I'm getting this right. But the perspective I think that you folks take is that the only person who can really sign up for a contract is the person who's producing the data. And the person who's consuming the data, you can write tests, you can like assert that things are true or not, but like ultimately you're not controlling this thing. And so you can't really raise your hand and say like, I'm going to commit to it being a certain way. Is that accurate?
100% accurate, right? Like it's like who is responsible for the quality of a car? It's not the driver. You don't there's no contract with the driver. It's the manufacturer. They have to. They're the one that's building the vehicle. Like they're the ones that have to do the testing and ensure it's safe. And if there's a problem with the vehicle, then they handle the recalls. Now the driver of the car should be responsible for like if their engine blows up, they need to take it into the factory. They need to go somewhere and say, hey, this is wrong. It's not what I expected. There's not a way for the manufacturer to know everything, but like fundamentally that responsibility has to stop with the producer.
Sorry, I interrupted you in the middle of a bulleted list.
No. I mean, I think that what you're bringing up is an excellent point, and it's one of I think there's a lot of ideas swirling around like what actually is a contract, and that's why like sometimes I chuckle about the idea of like a consumer contract because it just doesn't make sense. Like it's like who is the contract? Are you taking a contract with yourself or something? So yeah, like you can have monitors, and I think that monitors are really important. But if you don't have the other end, someone on the producer side that has agreed to act on those monitors, like who cares? Like you're just going to be getting a ton of alerts, 100 alerts a day that are completely non-actionable.
Prukalpa, this is like one of the central points that I'm concerned about. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for data producers, often software engineers, to want to do this. And we can get into that. But in practice, I haven't seen a lot of software engineering teams that want that. Have you? Are you seeing this in a different way than I am?
So I think that's where I think there's almost like we need to break the idealism as data people to what happens in reality. In reality, like software engineering teams are mostly slammed and mostly have like a ton of things to do. And mostly like, I think I was reading some article where like, enforcing a data contract seemed like just reading the article made it exhausting. Like it was exhausting. Like,
yeah, you can edit that to always, not mostly.
Yes. Yeah. Like, it won't happen in practice. Like, I think everyone has the right intentions, but like, in practice, everyone's also like bandwidth is a problem across every organization and so I think the way I think about this is, and the reason I think the idea of contracts is actually, and Chad touched on this, is powerful is because it's actually I think it's more human than it's actually system. The human agrees to something. And in some ways, I think the first step of that is knowledge. Help the human make better decisions. So for example, one thing that we're seeing a use case of, we recently launched an integration with Fivetran's metadata API, which basically means for the first time you can track changes all the way from BI all the way to Salesforce, Postgres. And a developer, when they're making a change, actually knows this is an executive dashboard that is going to get impacted by this change, right?
Are developers spending time in data catalogs?
We're definitely starting to see more of it as a use case. We're definitely starting to see a developer like that particular use case. And we can talk about like what is the right way for a developer to access this information, right? So whether that's the UI of a data catalog, whether that's they call in their CI/CD pipeline and they get a direct, like that's where we talk a lot about the activation of metadata, right? Like which is, it doesn't need to be this UI of a data catalog. Like there's metadata across your ecosystem that connects everything. And you can take it back into the tools that people are using every day through a GitHub action. And like you can take it. So how they're consuming it is to me the second order problem, and what's the best user experience for someone to be consuming it. But the fundamental knowledge and context that a developer needs when they're making a change is what is it breaking downstream? And even giving them access to that information at the time that they're making that change is actually a big step forward. I truly believe that developers don't want to make breaking changes. Like it's not like they don't have fun doing that, right? And so I think that's the first step of the process, which is how do we actually empower developers to know that they're making a breaking change? I think then there come second or third step, which is how do you create ease in human decision-making process? How do you enable machine-led decision-making process, right, for humans? And then, so for example, we're seeing cases where we have a customer that we open up metadata change events now through a Kafka queue. And so when there's a change, it auto-triggers, any metadata change auto-triggers a data quality test suite. And then you can basically say, hey, only if this passes, move the data from bronze layer in my warehouse to gold layer in my, like all of those are like, you can start doing like, machine-led triggers in your ecosystem, right? And then the third step is what Chad talked about, which is monitoring. Anytime you move from a human-led system to a system at scale, how do you monitor, have mass tests to test if these systems are working at scale? So I think it's a journey. Honestly, I think we're still at zero here. The first step is our developers don't even have knowledge of what breaking changes they're making. And I think it's a journey that we have to take as the modern data stack, but data teams, organizations to get to that point where that stops happening.
Tristan, your question is one of the number one things I hear when I when we talk about data contracts. And first of all, I want to strongly echo what Prukalpa said, because I have found, and we've been rolling this out at Convoy for 2 years now, but something that we found is that engineers are not like jerks. Like it's not that they're like, hey, you're going to break me. And they're like, screw you, I'm going to break you anyway, you piece of trash. Like, it's not my job. But I find that, so we actually have a term for this at Convoy, and we sort of call this the awareness phase, where as a software engineer in the modern data stack today, the data platform is a black box to you, right? You have a database, you have a production table that you maintain, you use it for some transactional use case. You know that, yeah, maybe you've got 5 trans hooked up to it or something, and somebody's using that data for some reason, but it goes over a fence sort of into the ether. And after that, like, you have no idea how it's being used or whether it's valuable or not. And so if sort of a data consumer then goes to a producer, says, hey, you're breaking me, you did this, you did that, like, they don't have any context on, like, okay, well, I didn't mean to break you. I'm just making changes to my database in order to fulfill the operational use case that I have. Like, don't come and yell at me about this. Like, I never even agreed to bend you this data in the first place. So, like, why are you taking a production dependency on it if it's that important, right? That's usually the reaction that they have. And it's less so like, I'm not going to agree to give you the thing that you want, valuable. So that's one thing. The other thing to sort of, call out is, like, I think a lot of these conversations mirror, like, event sourcing and just event sort of implementation in general, tools like, Mixpanel and Segment and a lot of these types of things. I spent a lot of my career working on experimentation, and we had sort of the exact same conversations back when that was getting implemented. Like, why should a software engineer care about implementing events specifically for, like, product teams and, like, product analytics teams? And the answer is, like, because it adds value to the business, and the tools were easy. Like, if it's easy and it fits into a developer workflow, it doesn't require a significant change in their pre-existing behavior, and their team gets a lot of value out of it. Like, over time, it just becomes sort of a common pattern. And I think that when it comes to data that's getting pushed into the warehouse, especially like first party data, like something coming from like S3, like that set of conversations about why it's valuable has not even happened yet. Like, it hasn't even happened en masse. And then like I said before, like a lot of the tooling's not there. Like, some of the questions right now are, how do we even do integration tests for data? Like, how does that work? So there's all these requirements on, like, how you fulfill a contract, and you have to figure this out. And there's not really a great pattern. You just kind of got to manually, sign up for things. And then the final thing I'll say is something that I've, experienced is, like, once data producers see that this thing that to them was just like it was just like exhaust, it's basically digital exhaust, is actually something that's driving, like, millions and millions of dollars for the company, they want to invest in it more. Like, they're like, oh, this is important, and it's something that I produce, and I can put it on my promotional package. I, like, did something great. So the amount of conversations that start to happen about the data go way up. But just to go back to what Prukalpa said, as long as that distance between the producer and the consumer exists, it's pretty much impossible to even, like, get to a point, get to an acknowledgement that data is meaningful. And that's why that level of awareness and the contract as the vehicle to have that conversation is so important.
I want to pivot off 3 words that you said in there. You said first party data. So that can be operational data in your Postgres database that drives your app. It can be events that get fired through your event pipelines. There is, because the software engineers on your team that work for your company are making those decisions, you can imagine how you could have a working relationship where both sides sign up for this thing together. Now, not all data is first-party data. It strikes me that Prukalpa, the solution that you're talking about where people have visibility, that can be for all different systems, but the folks who maintain the Stripe API are not checking in all the Atlan instances of all their customers and saying, like, well, is this API change going to break anybody downstream? How do we think about this for, like, data that is not first-party data? Are contracts just, like, not applicable in this context?
That's a great question. And I think there are probably layers to this, right? I think the first aspect of the layer to this is, I think, just what us as, like, the broader data stack itself can control. which is why I'm personally super excited by some of the things that, for example, like Fivetran's doing here, where like opening up a metadata API, which opens up across from source to at least like tables that Fivetran is pushing at the end of it, right? Which is typically the starting point that a data team starts working on that data, right? And there's layers there that you can start controlling, and you can start controlling at these things like if someone's making a change in a Salesforce object in your own organization, how does that affect downstream? I think it gets a little bit more complicated as you say, okay, a change in a Stripe API, for example. But again, I think if Stripe API is consumed across 4,000 data teams that is being powered through a single, like it's going into Snowflake through a single API, I think that starts giving you more, there's more overall aggregate there, right? For Stripe to care about the changes that they're making in their API. And so I think there's small changes, which are organizational level. There's bigger changes, which is data stack ecosystem level. And then there's overall ecosystem level, which is when Stripe talks to Snowflake, which talks to like that ecosystem. And I think we're still at that organizational level, mostly in most organizations right now. That's the first problem we have to solve as an industry. But some of the foundational work that's happening, even in the last year, the foundational work that's happening, like some of the stuff that would like with DBT and the semantic layer and and like with Fivetran and like the API, like there's lots of things that are happening at a foundational layer even in the last 12 months that make a lot of these things possible. And I think it is going to be a journey. It will be a 2 to 3 year journey as the ecosystem and the stack matures. But I think there's a path there that we can take.
I always say, like, at a certain scale, it's like almost harder to take away a product than it is to release a product. So like Stripe can't just change their API or their data schema without an enormous amount of energy and pain and notification and like backwards compatibility, most likely. And so at a certain scale, like these schemas or tables become more dependable. It becomes harder when your own people get meddling in like Salesforce objects, or they're creating some kind of process of data, and that just changes without the downstream effect. And I think you won't ever solve that at source. That's why you have like a belt and suspenders approach, where it's like, well, you tried to not create the bad data, but you're going to, so like might as well have alerts that are tell you really quickly to go fix the problem.
And it's probably always going to be a mix of all of these approaches, right? I don't think it's going to be, we'll do this data contract thing and it will solve all our problems magically. It's probably like there'll always be a mix of agility versus governance, moving fast versus breaking things. I don't know if that's a good slogan to say anymore in 2022, but there's always going to be a balance.
There's a tension.
Yeah. And I think there's like, I don't think there's a silver bullet answer to this that's ever, like there will be cases, like there will be cases where ideally we should like productionize systems. You want to make sure that as much as possible, things don't break. Some other kinds of analytics, maybe you let go of governance for agility. Like I think there are layers in the ecosystem, and I don't think it's going to be one answer or one size fits all across data teams and use cases.
Prukalpa, you mentioned the semantic layer earlier. And a while ago, I would not have thought that there was a role for that in this conversation at all. But I've increasingly seen this problem as how do we provide abstraction layers? So I think that most of the time when we're talking about data contracts, we're talking about the ingestion of first-party data into the lake or warehouse, and how do we make sure that that data doesn't change, break to everything downstream. But this same structure of problem shows up between the transformation layer and the BI layer, where you have analytics engineers changing stuff, and then the BI tools, multiple BI tools don't get updated. And so the introduction of this semantic layer, or like any abstraction layer between these two different layers, creates an opportunity when one of them changes, or when the upstream one changes, to create compatibility between the existing downstream functionality. Chad, I wonder if you want to talk at all about, this kind of blew my mind when we spoke before, that you didn't think that there should ever be direct CDC into the data warehouse and like models built directly. What's the abstraction layer that you're kind of proposing in your model of the world?
Maybe never is a strong word. Like I
okay, sure.
The way I see it is that there's basically a test environment. There needs to be a test environment or prototype environment for data where you get the full, so copy of the production table into Snowflake. You can experiment with that. You can understand like what that data means. You can try piping it through a model, try putting it into a dashboard. But the point at which like that actually needs to become production grade, right? We need to start surfacing this to a customer, or it fuels a machine learning model, or it goes into a dashboard that, the board looks at or something. Then there's another level of quality that needs to be put into place. But to answer your question directly, like what do I think is the right layer of abstraction from CDC? I think that there, sort of like Prukalpa said, I do think that it is a maturity curve. And I think the start of that maturity curve is basically still just like CDC, right? It's people saying, there's some CDC, there's some like schema or property that's very meaningful to me. And I just want to ensure that the schema like doesn't break terribly. And if you are going to introduce a backwards incompatible change, can you like please tell me and like just give me a heads up that this change is coming? I think that and that's where I call that a contract, and we have like quite a few of those contracts at Convoy. It's like a pretty easy on ramp for teams that are just getting started with this process. But very quickly, those teams realize like, okay, I now have 5 or 6 or 7 teams that are all using that data, and they're all asking for contracts. And like sometimes those contracts are contradictory. And that's not good. And so we want to essentially provide this layer of abstraction. And what we use is stream processing. And so we essentially say like, you can go out and we use KSQL, but you can use Materialize or whatever it is that you want. And you say, software engineers, what data you need to vend as part of the contract. You've already agreed to do it. So you can decouple your production table and whatever contract data you're pushing to a consumer. You can write some little KSQL query that ensures that all the data is in the right format. And then that is the API that you then deliver to these consumers. And all of those folks that previously were asking for totally separate contracts can now just take one. But I think there's one level beyond that, which is total decoupling, right? And total decoupling would basically be events. So these are events emitted in the production code, these like semantic objects, like, maybe I care about, when a shipment was canceled and I need to go into my service. I need to implement that. And then I treat that as an API. And now that's completely separate from my, from my production table. And I can operate my production table however I want. So I think that's sort of the maturity curve of abstraction over time. At Convoy, we have people doing all of those things. The most advanced teams are doing like events, like super high quality events for a very, specific use case. Some folks are doing the SQL abstraction, and some folks are just saying, don't break my CDC stuff.
When we talk about production, it's like you've mentioned it a few times. You need a contract if it's a production table, or we're talking about a model that has, millions of dollars of implication for your business. Are data contracts needed for production use cases? What the heck is production versus non-production use case? And how should teams think about when a contract is needed versus when it's, okay, this is an undue burden to create a contract on everything. So where's the line?
Chad, you mentioned before, you said, if the board looks at this. And for me, yeah, sure, I'll say this out loud. I think that the dashboards that the board looks at are probably the lowest on my priority. I want to know what our digital ads team is looking at, the operational people in the company.
I am not presenting to the board, so you may have a different impression of this than I do, and things that I've heard at Convoy. But I basically look at it as a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have things that are very clearly prototypes, right? Like we just implemented some brand new feature. We know that feature is going to change. We need to get a really directional sense of how things are going and just understand what this data is. But I'm not going to be showing this to my CEO anytime soon. I'm certainly not going to be pushing it to some dashboard embedded in the product or anything like that. That's definitely a prototype use case. And then on the other end, we have things that we know for sure are not prototype use cases. We've got a financial reporting pipeline, and we need to report those numbers for auditing and compliance reasons. Or we have a machine learning model that we know needs to be stable because it forms the backbone of our business. And then in between, there's a range, right? There's some things that, okay, this is definitely very important. It's used for it's critical for decision making. Do we need 100% of it to be strictly under contract? Maybe not, right? Maybe there's 10 columns here. 8 of them we know for sure we need under contract, and maybe the other 2 we're still trying to experiment with and figure out. So I do think it's a spectrum, but the sort of reference that I've used a lot at Convoy is that if data quality contributes meaningfully to ROI, that's probably a good indicator that you need to start thinking about the contract.
Is it at all scales of businesses?
No, definitely not. So in the ideal world, right, like at least in my mind, the way that I think about contracts and really just this whole sort of production grade pipeline process is sort of like it's like DevOps, right? Do you need really, finely tuned, highly structured, high governance DevOps from day one? No. Do you need some DevOps and some governance from day one? It's probably really helpful. And it also allows you to scale that process really easily, like once you hit the point where you need it, right? It's like way harder to implement this highly governed thing if you have a software engineering team of like 300 people that's never followed a process before. So I think it follows a similar pattern here where, do you really need to have strict contracts from day one? No, you don't. But if you have a process of data producers and data consumers talking to each other, that allows you to achieve that so much easier when you actually get to be a company of Convoy size.
Yeah.
My recommendation is usually like, once the software engineering team becomes so large that it's difficult for the data engineers or the data consumers to be in every meeting and understand, hey, we just launched a new feature and this is what the data looks like. That's when the communication becomes like really difficult, and something like a contract can be helpful for those high quality use cases.
I think the only one thing I would add to that, though, is that the interesting thing we're starting to see is that the importance of this is not just governed by the size of the company as much as it's about the type of the use case. So one of the interesting things we're starting to see is people starting to actually drive, like we all talked about like someone using a dashboard to make a decision. And the thing about that process is it's still a human, and the human can catch the error. But one of the things that we're starting to see a lot of is now, it's a 200-person company, and they're doing it's a media monitoring platform, which means that this is actually like live, like every change that's happening is actually live affecting decisions that their customers are making. And there's no human in the middle in this process.
I think you're referencing data activation.
Actually, no, I'm not. I'm actually talking about like a data platform built on Snowflake of a company whose entire business model is based on media monitoring that they're doing downstream, right? So, or I can give you another example. Like this is a much larger company, but their modern data stack is powering a live customer experience platform. So it's triggering live emails that are going to customers. It's triggering, like, there's no human in the middle making this process, right? Like this is actual live business, like business product stuff that's being triggered downstream. So when there are hundreds and thousands, so for example, in this case, hundreds and thousands of change events happening on a daily basis in their data lake, which triggers things like PII and triggers things like security notifications that need to start happening downstream. There's a lot of actual impact. Like what we're starting to see is there are much smaller teams where the entire company is like the data platform is the backbone of the entire company. And in those kinds of use cases where the use case is not just operational analytics or trying to make better, like helping the company make better decisions through data, but actually helping the product or helping the end consumers and businesses make better decisions through data, through live automated platforms, the importance of this becomes a lot more, even in smaller organizations and smaller teams.
Yeah, it's a full system. This has been a fantastic conversation. I think we could do a whole nother hour, but we have to wrap up. So we ask this of all our guests. Looking 10 years out, what do you hope will be true of the data industry?
I would love to see data treated with the same standards of any other feature, right? It's part of the product. It's got great CI/CD, awesome change management, strong APIs, version control, all that amazing stuff. And I think that if you have that at the producer level, then there's so many amazing things that you can start to build on in the warehouse. I think the idea of a semantic layer becomes so much easier if you've got a set of contracts that have some semantic meaning already attached to them. If there's an API that every company in every data company within the modern data stack can attach to. I think that solves this problem of interoperability, right? All these tools speak different languages, and you need to have a separate data model for each of them, because like none of these tools understand inherently what this data is. But if there's contracts powering all of this, then that becomes a trivial problem. And I think that in that sort of universe, I think the value of data and the ability to leverage data to solve real world problems increases by an order of magnitude.
I think the thing that I think the most about is, and what's beautiful about the time we live in, is that this data function is becoming a thing, right? It's becoming real. Like there's an actual practice of what a data team should look like and how we should work together and how we should work with other teams. And 20 years ago, that was where product teams were. And maybe, you go back a little further and that was where software teams were. And those teams found great ways to work together, right? Like Agile became a thing. Jobs to be done became a thing. DevOps became a thing. And so I think the thing that both excites me the most, but I hope we spend the most amount of time on in the next decade, is the reality is that most individual data practitioners are spending 40 to 70% of their time on non-directly value creating work. And what I mean by that is I think about this concept from lean and supply chain, actually. Like, I think there's a lot we can learn from those kinds of teams as well. And back in the day, the way Toyota defined this was anything in your entire stream of tasks that are happening in a process, any of those tasks that are not directly related to creating value for the end customer is waste. And all of lean was about finding every aspect of waste in the process and eliminating waste. And there's a ton of in some ways, like data is actually like a supply chain, right? Like we have raw materials that's coming from a producer that we can't control, and we're the processors in the middle and we're delivering it to a customer. And so I think tooling's made this much better than it was 4 years ago, but it could become a lot better. And so I guess my hope and dream is that 5 years from now, we're not talking about that layer. Data practitioners are actually spending as much of their time on creating as much value as possible. And we can start talking about the next order of things, right? How do we structure data teams? How do we collaborate with other functions inside organizations? And those kinds of things start becoming more of our commonplace data Twitter debate in organizations.
Moving up the stack. Yeah, I love that. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks for joining us. Where can people find you if they want to learn more?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Chad J. Sanderson. And if you want to read some of my writing and the writing of some of my friends over at Convoy that have been working on implementing data contracts, you can follow me at the Data Products Substack.
And I am also on Twitter and LinkedIn at Prukalpa, just my first name. And me and some of my team write a Substack called Metadata Weekly. And so excited to continue the conversation.
Thanks so much for joining us both. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs and is hosted by Tristan Handy and myself, Julia Schottenstein. Have comments, questions, or guest suggestions? Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com. Our producers are Jeff Fox and David Krevitt. If you enjoy the show, please drop a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.